So right out of the gate, what has been your favorite session you've ever run or been a part of? And this could be a both if we want. I have stuff to talk about if you're okay with me starting. So I will play things that I am really happy with and that I've been running. There's a long list. Many of them live in Grey Owls, but it's a lot of moments where the resistance disappeared. And we've had a lot of those in Grey Owls, but especially all my Feywild sessions and all my Shadowfell sessions, there's very low resistance to the flow of how everything comes through. But if I had to pick one right now, it would be the most recent time that I have been able to run a game, and that would be yesterday, which was on a Saturday, and I got to do a physically distant game, where as opposed to running it in Roll20, we set ourselves up with proper distancing. A lot of like switching between wearing masks and then being at appropriate distance, and then being able to take them off and actually act and look at each other's faces and stuff. But anytime we needed to move things on the map, we just put a mask on. It was a different way of doing things, but since these protocols are already cemented in our daily lives by this point, we kind of just adapted with them. It wasn't annoying, and we worked around making sure that we were always being safe. And then how do we just have a positive experience? And the game was the Monarchies of Mal, which is the Pugmire other side of it, where you get to all play as cats. And I specifically made shenanigans, things for them to just interact with. Yes, there was an end goal. There might be combat, but Pugmire and Mao especially are not combat heavy. They're not really built to be combat heavy games. They have combat systems because they're based on 5e. They're based on the open source SRD. However, it's more about the narrative, collaborative story. Even initiative is you roll for whoever goes first, but then they pick who goes next, and that includes the GM in that cycle. So the GM goes, and then they pick who goes next and what makes the most appropriate story. They also have inspiration that's a joint pool of inspiration. Like I have a little dog bowl that's full of inspiration tokens, and they can choose to spend it as a group to re-roll things, or they spend a larger amount of it and they describe how it just succeeds in a cool way. And there's a give and take to that narrative storytelling. And once we prefaced all of that at the start, the flow of everything was extremely satisfying because we were telling a collective story. So if something hilarious happened, we just went with it. And I would give them a chip if they just kind of went with this strange happenstance. And then they give me a chip if they really enjoyed something. And I can use that to be like, in initiative, I go now. Because you do have a tendency in combat, if you can pick who goes first, the bad guys always go last. But my red chips can say, I'm going now. And then I get to upset the order. But then when my turn's done, I still pick a player to go. And it's a really interesting dynamic that was wholly satisfying, really enjoyable, and just full of laughter. We were having a splendid time, all like collectively failing together. There was a lot of that, but that also made the triumphs, which are natural 20s, that much more amazing. And we got to have a really young player. We had an 8-year-old playing with us for the first time that they've ever played with us. And that made it extra cool to have this cute and fluffy adventure full of chaos and silliness. But I did this for someone's birthday, and it was absolutely wonderful. One, to return to this physical space to some degree, just to be able to be in maybe like the backyard with everyone else. It was really cool. And then to all of us buy into, this is going to be shenanigan filled. We're going to go toward the rule of cool, the rule of fun, for all of these things that we resolve, and even in combat. And it was wonderful to run it.
Yeah, you mentioned a few things there that are really cool to unpack. So the first being, and I noticed this teaching martial arts when we first were, we're having a gradual reopening where, like, students they have to register online in advance to like show up, to make sure that, you know, we don't have to turn anyone away at the door, because we can only allow so many people into the training space at a time. But when you start teaching people in person after you've gotten used to just seeing them over a webcam, it almost feels like drinking Mountain Dew for the first time, where it's like just like a blast of energy and you're just like, right? And it's almost like you haven't built up a tolerance to it, you know, where like it's so, having that energy in person is just so exciting and overwhelming. It really is a super cool thing when you're able to do it, and when you're able to find a structure that's safe, you know. And the other thing that you said that I really I've been meditating on for the past few days is I recently watched a video on YouTube by WASD20, which is with Nate. And one of the videos he released recently was 6 things he doesn't like about 5th edition. And, you know, it's one of those things where he even said in the video, 5th edition is a game of choice. That doesn't mean that there aren't aspects of the system that he would prefer to explore in a different way, or he's not critical of, right? And to me, I find, especially the way we've been running our games, being critical a little bit of the thing that you love allows you to find a way to find even more love for it, you know? So, and the thing here is this the best system to run what you want, you know? And like what you were saying with Pugmire, Adam, is perfect. You identify up front, Pugmire is a system that's not about combat. Combat is a component of it, but it's really about telling awesome stories with your pets, you know, and kind of seeing your pets' perspectives of everything. So if we agree on, you know, these are the best rules to satisfy the best experience we want, now all of a sudden that's going to align for a much more immersive and satisfying experience, right? It's kind of like when I wanted to run Mechton, I wanted to run a Gundam RPG. You know, 5th edition wasn't appropriate. Mechton as a base system also wasn't appropriate, because it was just, there was a lot of unnecessary mechanics that would take away from the storytelling. So what mechanics do you keep? What mechanics do you change in order to kind of fit the experience you want? So one of the things that Nate had said is that this was like 3 out of his 6 bullet points, where just D&D is not gritty enough for the experience that he wants to deliver right now. That means 5th edition probably isn't like, you might try like Zweihander or something like that, you know? Right. That's like a system that's designed to deliver the experience that you're going for. And I found that to be a really helpful way to kind of frame it, because again, as the dungeon master, your goal is to create the habits in your players that you want to see and discourage the habits that you don't. So if you're one that's uncomfortable with players being rules lawyers, how do you set up a system that discourages them from rules lawyering, you know? So yeah, I just thought that was a really neat way to kind of tie those two thoughts together. Just, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of each system, and how you can do little things to complement those weaknesses to produce an experience that everyone can enjoy.
I think it's interesting that we recognize that kind of thing right now, because if we look at a few years ago when Undertale came out, Undertale was such an interesting, it wasn't like revolutionary or anything like that. It wasn't like super innovative, but the way it presented its story allowed for players to make different choices that would have a strong impact on the rest of the game that they play. So what was cool about it is that you had 3 different pathways you could choose. You could choose the neutral pathway, which was generally like you kill some of the monsters, you save some of the others. It's not a big deal. There's the true pacifist ending, which is where you spare all of them. And that's like the most story-laden pathway, where you learn pretty much everything. Actually, not everything, but almost everything you need to know about the game and what kind of story it's telling. And then there's the genocide route, which is where you kill everything. It's the shortest pathway.
Spoiler
alert. Yeah, well, that's how you do it if you're wondering.
Oh yeah.
It's the shortest pathway, but you get to see the dark side of what you could be as a player, because your character is an embodiment of your mentality as a video gamer. At least that's how I've interpreted it, and how Toby Fox has generally come across when he's talked about it. And so for me, it's interesting when we talk about these things about what kind of rewards you're giving your players, because they might want a more story-heavy campaign that is more role-play or exploration and not so much on the combat. And as a DM, it's important to recognize when and when not to take those paths. The other way is that it's actually kind of ironic, because the combat in D&D takes the longest, whereas the storytelling, you probably accomplish a lot more storytelling in the same amount of time it would take you to go through 3 rounds of combat.
There were 2 specific instances of running MAU yesterday where my D&D brain kicked in, and I was like, oh, I could roll initiative here, but wouldn't it be 1, faster, and 2, more fun if we just told it like a story?
Yeah.
And instead there might be skill checks, but we're not going to slow things down as action, whatever, for what we're going to do here. They were on chocobos, essentially, with big, like, 3x3 platforms tied to the back of them, and they're balancing while mice are shooting webbing in balloons across them. They're in like a carnival race thing, like a Ninja Warrior thing. And there's a point where one of the chocobos got splattered with the webbing, but stuck to a different chocobo. And I did that because they made similar rolls and they were right next to each other, so they veered and then stuck to each other. And this is getting frenetic and crazy, and we could roll initiative here, but why? Because they're all buying into it anyway. Oh, which one does it kind of like, does one chocobo like lift the other one up and keep going? Like, let me roll for the chocobo. Natural 20, lifts other chocobo up and is now carrying both groups as they spiral forward. That's silly and fun, and we don't need to break it down mechanically because we've already established this is about the story and the fun narrative that we're making together. So let's roll with it.
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.